If no one else has an opinion that they want more time, then maybe we could just jump into it. I'm not sure exactly how I want to structure this. So this is the first time we're doing sort of a design review. The last breakout session was a performance presentation. I don't know if you want to maybe just give us all the high level from your perspective of what we're trying to accomplish here. Although it is fairly clear from the doc, but maybe that'd be a helpful bit of context in the recording, at least.
Yeah, I mean, most of it's based on, our use cases and things that we've seen, people on my team, and that sort of informs the fact that there's the two parts of it, right? There's the part for just remote launching things over SSH, and then sort of the more sophisticated launch service node part that covers a bunch of additional situations from our use case. But
yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense. We had multi-computer robots that were supported in ROS that we're going to need support. So I get that. I was working on a robot that had 2 computers inside it before this.
So I guess one thing I'd be interested in is people who have other use cases or things that they don't think might be covered by this. I'd be interested in hearing that.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess if there's no one else jumping in to say anything, I'll start with my questions, and I can put these as comments on the document as well, which may be helpful.
This is Roger Strain. I've actually been working with Matt on this, and I think maybe just a little bit more vocalized context here on the 2 sides of this. From the ROS 1 side, when we were doing multi-machine launching, basically you were relying on having that persistent SSH connection in order to keep those remote processes alive. And if your initial launch environment ever stopped for any reason, that would go shut down everything. In some cases, that is probably the desired good behavior that you want. But in other cases that we've had where we've wanted to, say, start up something from a development laptop but then leave it running, that presented a problem, because now you need to have that launch process running somewhere. Part of what we're trying to do here is allow you to both keep that existing functionality of, I'm going to have a persistent connection, and if my launcher goes away, the connection goes away and the remote process dies. But we also want you to have the ability of saying, okay, you know what, I'm going to kick this thing off, and then it's going to be alive out there, and I can come back in, I can close my current connection and I can come back in later using the other tools that would be available to say, okay, shut everything down. So we're kind of trying to introduce a way to have both concepts available at the same time, and you can use whichever one's most appropriate.
Yeah, I think the thing that I was wondering about there was that if you, say, have a flaky internet connection, and it's not even that you are intending to disconnect, it's that you just don't want the nodes to die if all of a sudden the connection between the 2 machines gets slow. I guess that's where the launch service node comes in.
Precisely.
Well. Yeah, makes perfect sense, because you may be considering them 2 halves of an application and they're both running, say, device drivers, and if even if the connection between them isn't super reliable, you still want both sides to continue running once they've started until explicitly exiting. So with the launch service node, this may be specified in here. If you shut down the launch context that you initially spawned, because basically you have a single launch context, which will, is the idea that the remote machine needs to have a launch service node running, or is it that if you specify it, your remote launching will start one of those launch service nodes as the first thing that it does?
I will defer to Matt if you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what you mean.
I think I get what you're going at. I don't believe the intent here is that you have to use the launch service node.
That's not the question. The question is, if you want to use it, do you have to start it up on the remote machine beforehand? Or is it the first thing that's remote launched when you start the remote launch process?
You'd start it manually.
Okay. Is that explicit in here?
Yeah, I would see that as being something where you would define that launch service node as a thing in your launch file, which would be launched through the remote execute method. And it would in turn be told, these are now the things that you are going to be authorized to launch.
Maybe I would jump in on that context on one remark, because overall, I think the use case is well described in the document, but I think there are multiple aspects which are not strictly only applying to remote launching or multi-machine launching, right? Because this example, like that you start launch and you want to be able to detach yourself, is something you can't even do locally. So, and I think it would help if we split those things into like separate pieces. First, launch need to be able to do this detaching in a local environment, and then you can transfer that concept to also work in the remote environment.
Yeah, for local, I would imagine you'd start one of these launch service nodes locally instead of using the remote launch. But there still needs to be a way, to start processes through launch that allows them to sort of be detached. Because right now it hangs on to those futures and it doesn't want to let go of anything.
And I think there are other parts of this in the document where you see like, oh, you want to be able to query later what processes or how many processes are running, what is the user, resource users, etc. That's all something you can't do locally either. So I think if we split that one up into what are the things which are really strictly necessary for remote, and then features, of course, you want for that scenario, but you also want to use locally, that will hopefully keep both separate parts of the features like more tractable.
Yeah, I think that sort of level of separation is sort of what I have in my head, even though it's all in one document. But like the launch service node sort of being a much more separate component than just the basic launch functionality. So maybe that almost warrant two separate design documents, one just sort of honing in on just the remote launch specifically, and then the other adding in those extra things like the launch service node and the ability to do the queries and detach processes and all that. Is that sort of what you're getting at, Dirk?
That's my understanding. That it sounds like we have
Yes.
two features here that can be designed to be robust independently.
But because you could argue like, oh, the remote launching is already super valuable, even if you can't detach and even if you can't monitor the status and stuff, that's already like one feature valuable. And you can argue without remote launching, resource usage monitoring locally and detaching is also super valuable. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely envision implementation-wise, we just focus on initially just the remote launching, because that's like the first piece and sort of the core thing we're trying to achieve here. And then we'd go on to doing the other stuff once, the basic SSH launch capabilities.
I would expect even for the local launch, like if you want to be able to detach, that will require probably quite some changes because basically the whole current idea is based on the fact that you start something and that one is actively like running, watching for events and reacting, right? And you need to be able to detach that in terms of like your script just stops working, but this logic continues to run to do whatever, right?
Right.
Somehow moved over into a persistently running process, either locally or in the remote scenario, of course, remotely.
Yeah, and a lot of that, like event processing and stuff that's going on in the current launch service is sort of one of my areas of concern because I could sort of see how it can be very complex and used in sort of complex, unpredictable ways, at least unpredictable to me because I haven't used it a whole lot. And so I don't really have a good intuition on what the implications would be of trying to do launch without that, if that makes sense.
So, I think that's a valid feedback on this, that maybe this is two documents that can utilize each other to make the functionality more combinatorially useful. Yeah, I wonder how we integrate it with security, although that seems like a sort of separate discussion in and of itself.
Yeah, it is. I've been sitting in on the security working group meetings and have been mentioning with them, that this effort was going on. And one of the things that came up over there is that, they're going to be generating a variety of key stores and files like that are relevant to the secure ROS effort. And as we start moving onto different machines, we're going to need to be able to actually transfer those SROS credentials and key stores over to the remote machine so that the nodes on those machines can have the appropriate information available to them.
Yep. Yeah. And you need to make sure that you're sending that stuff in a secure way. Although, you're using SSH and you already have a key.
Right.
Yeah. And then, a lot more security issues are going to come up when we start talking in detail eventually about this launch service node. Because if you just have a node running that you can ask it to run executables on a machine over DDS, that could be prone to abuse if it's not very tightly reined in.
Yeah, we actually had that discussion internally, before this document got pushed out for everybody. And, the first cut was, oh, we're just going to expose a service and here's a command line, go off and do it. And we're like, well, now wait a minute. Maybe we want to narrow down that this particular launch node can only launch a certain subset of things that I tell it about beforehand. And if it's not one of those things that I said you are allowed to run this, then it won't do it.
Yeah, I had a question about the allowable processes. It makes perfect sense within an SROS context where you have sort of really locked down your system in terms of what can talk to each other. Although when you think about the fact that you have SSH access to the remote machine, you are able to execute arbitrary processes within the permission of that user. And so it does make sense that you could do that. And I was wondering if this allowable processes can be set to a null set or something, especially for early in development when you're not sure what you want to launch. Maybe you want an interactive session to the remote launch service node in order to just spin up and down things as you're testing. Is that part of the understanding of the design, that if you don't specify, it's everything, or if you don't specify, it's nothing?
Personally, I might lean more towards having that be an explicit flag that you could set to say, I want to allow everything. Not specifying anything just feels like maybe I forgot to do something and now I've accidentally allowed anything to be run. Because it's absolutely true that, okay, I've got SSH access, I can get in there and run whatever I want to. But what I'm doing is standing up a process that has that same access and which can now be accessed over DDS. So at that point, anybody who is able to, via DDS, communicate to that node and send the request is going to be able to execute anything, whether they had the SSH key to it or not.
But the idea is that you use SROS to restrict who is able to talk and tell that service to do something, right? The same.
Well, sure, yeah. That would be the intention, but I don't necessarily know if we want to assume that SROS is always going to be something that's turned on and enabled.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's recommended, but not everyone's going to have it all the time.
But I think it boils down to a similar case in ROS 1 where you can just spawn a new node with a node name which already exists. It shuts down the existing one. Yeah, of course, that's a huge open door for like screwing over your system. But, well, if you allow someone to do it, you kind of like gave him the blank permission to do it, right? I mean, yes, extra filtering and whitelisting would be fine, but I can see so many cases where you remotely want to be able to just spawn another process for debugging, spawn something, and you wouldn't be able to do that. I don't know if it's worth the effort having a second layer of that if SROS is supposed to deal with that very precisely.
Yeah, I sort of felt some of the like specifying exactly which commands it can run might be too restrictive. I think it's a good idea to sort of have that flag though, where you can have a more flexible version of it running, or you can set a lot, shut down, restart nodes with different parameters and stuff.
I mean, I think part of the discussion here is, do we need that at all? Or do we just say, hey, if you use this, you are opening a vulnerability unless you have it secured using SROS?
So we could just say that it always just runs whatever, but you have to trust it over. I guess my thing is there a case where we want to use this remote launch service node to run things other than ROS nodes? Because if not, then we can at least restrict the commands to ROS nodes that it has on board and knows about. Instead of just sending it a command line string to run, we send it like a node name package and whatever params that particular node needs. And that can only do nodes, but
that makes perfect sense to me because this is part of the ROS system. Like the fact that they were able to start the connection to this launch service node in the first place means they have SSH access. So if they want to run arbitrary shell commands, they can probably just start an SSH session separately and don't really need for that. It's because it's probably, I mean, I don't know, maybe you're orchestrating a larger system that it includes non-ROS parts using launch. I haven't seen that use case in the wild myself, but that's only a limited amount of experience.
Yeah, I don't think we are, and I've not seen it either, but I feel like that, like a lot of the design decisions in launch so far have very intentionally been created to leave that open.
Generic, yeah. I mean, the way I personally do it on my robot right now is I gave it in ROS 2. I use a couple of systemd services that all depend on a parent service, but you could do that with launch instead. I could just run those processes.
But you could argue that the remote launch, you either run a remote execute to spawn your foothold on the other machine, right? And that one then has ROS services to actually spawn more stuff, like your remote instance of your launch context, whatever that would look at, however that would look like. But somebody could just run another execute process and not talk to that other side's context, but just run another arbitrary command on that machine. That would still be through the launch API, but it would not go through this like ROS specific launching API. So I think that sounds like a good separation.
Would be to only allow this launch service node to launch ROS nodes that exist on the system already.
Yeah, I think that's probably a better direction to take with the launch node. Yeah, and like Dirk and you said, you need to start an SSH process, just use the built-in thing that will have in place.
Yeah, I guess you could just do an SSH run this command via execute process.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, that was the part I didn't get.
And you might run into examples where you don't directly launch like a ROS node as like package name, node name, but you actually launch it through some container or something. So I mean that could be more complicated in the future, but I think you can still restrict it to something ROS specific on the other side's context. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think we've got these two halves. The first part where we're just doing the SSH launching, I think it'd probably be nice if that could live entirely in just the launch package as opposed to ROS launch.
The launch service node?
No, not the service node. The service node would be in the ROS part, but the SSH launching
Remote
itself.
execute.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. The split of, remote execute being in launch and the service node being in launch ROS.
Yeah, so maybe we're just like sort of split the document and have one focused on changes to one repo and another focused on the changes to the other repo.
Yeah. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, and so there'll still sort of need to be this idea of being able to start something locally and detach. Is that something that is not a concept, right, that exists right now in launch? So that even just that itself, is that its own refactor or?
Let's see. So the detaching would depend on the launch service node already existing in some context, local or remote. and you would discover it via its topics, just via DDS discovery, right? So
well, but if you're using this to start that remote node, then it has to be able to start it and let go of it.
Well, the thing is, currently your launch process has like ongoing.
So you might need a new launch feature. Yeah, like a fork rather than a. Wait, which one's the process that you can detach from? You fork it rather than sub-threading it or whatever.
I mean, the main thing is you need to have something continue to run locally on the remote machine, whatever you do, which continues to do the duties of like checking for events, potentially restarting nodes when they shut down, and things like that, right? You need that reactive part to continue working. And I think separating the current main invocation when you type ROS launch, that process, from what it's doing afterwards, I think that's definitely going to be a refactoring.
Does it have to be a very large refactor though, or can you just have something that sort of receives the launch context and spins up the existing functionality in a new process?
Yeah, like without hanging on to the future, because that's sort of what happens now, right? It starts up a process, but it sort of clings to that future. And
I don't have a good enough idea how much refactor or modification that would have.
Like, I'm wondering if you could put a fairly thin shim on it of just saying, basically have the new process also call launch so that most of that functionality doesn't have to be changed, and just add a place where it can exit instead of hanging on to it.
Yeah, well, Roger's in the midst of another refactor on launch to sort of break up some of the logic from the data, and I don't know how well this would fit into that, but
but it makes sense.
What do you think, Roger?
I think that once we get that other refactor done, any of these discussions are going to be easier because right now the execute process and the ROS just node objects have so much stuff that's all bundled into them that anything we try to do to tease stuff apart is going to be difficult. Once we get that refactor done, that's going to simplify matters. But there's still going to be work to be done. Obviously, that logic does have to live somewhere, and I definitely have a little bit of concerns about making sure that with how much of the stuff is dynamically potential through the Python-based launch files, making sure that we get that environment rebuilt properly, either on a local process that we can detach from, or even more difficult on a remote process that we're going to be detaching from. There's definitely work that's going to have to be done very carefully there, but it will be easier post refactor.
Yeah. Oh, so I guess I was thinking that and this maybe doesn't make sense. I was thinking that the launch service node would be accessible just via topics. But if we're doing an SSH over, say, a WAN, that's not necessarily true.
My intent was for it to be pretty much only accessible over topics once it's started.
Okay, so it would have to be on the LAN, or you would have to be using a DDS implementation that provides you some sort of WAN bridge, which, as far as I know, in ROS2, only RTI does that right now.
Yeah, once you got it up and running. So maybe calling it like a launch service node isn't as appropriate because it's not really recreating the launch service. It's just sort of like a monitor or something. It's almost like
it's like a lifecycle manager.
ROS master, but in a more distributed way. So like each machine sort of has one. So it's like a monitor or something.
Yeah, but you could have as many as you wanted on a given machine. There's nothing stopping you from that, right?
Right.
Just
and we want to be able to launch these. We want to launch this locally too, right? Because you might want to have one of these nodes on the machine that you're actually executing the launch script from. So you're going to be able to start that local process and be able to detach. And so we need to detach not just from the SSH ones we launch, but also from starting local processes.
It's starting to make me think of the container node that you can load and unload containers from, or not containers, components.
Yeah.
ROS2 components from at runtime.
Yeah, and that was a sort of an inspiration for some of these ideas, and I was trying to figure out how to get all the features built into it. It's like, oh, this sort of is a precedent that I can follow.
Yeah, makes sense.
Although you still can't just start the container node and detach from it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the piece that's sort of the biggest unknown that sort of is sitting in my head, and I'm not really sure what to do with, but I see it coming up.
Yeah,
so I guess we'll wait and see what the Rogers refactor makes it look like, and
that makes
hopefully
sense.
it'll be clear then.
Okay, so there is no, I think that's something else that should be called out explicitly in here. And I think it's called out implicitly by the fact that a lot of these interfaces are specified by messages and services. But maybe I'll just put a top level comment of that we're expecting to interact with the remote launch service node purely over topics, which means that it has to be within the current discoverable DDS network.
Yeah, I can make that more explicit. And even when I start separating out the documents, that'll probably also help make it explicit, and I can, on the node one, just sort of focus only on the DDS side of things.
Cool. And that was that sort of puts me into one of my next questions, which was, are we expecting that each launch service node, and I know we're talking about splitting out the design, but I think these questions still inform the, either half of the design that it will be split out, is we have these various messages like the heartbeat and the process status and querying status. Are we expecting that each launch service node will be namespaced within its unique ID, or do we want to put the machine ID in these messages? So will there be separate topics for each launch service node? I guess is the question.
Yeah, I was just about to ask. I know you can have multiple publishers on a topic, and so we could have one scheme of doing things where they're all publishing on the same topic, so the tools only have to know to look for that topic. And then they just have all their unique identifier information in the messages. But can you do that with services? Can you have multiple nodes having a service? Yeah.
Well, so yeah, the way that services are created right now is they are namespaced by if I understand correctly, they're namespaced by the node ID, node name, and nodes can have the same name. But if you're in that situation where multiple nodes have the same name and they expose the same service, then you don't know for sure which node is going to fulfill the service call. It's arbitrary and non-deterministic.
It'll be only one, or will they all sort of get the service request and try to fulfill it?
They all get the service request, and they will raise sending you an answer back, and you will get the first answer you get. You will actually get in the userland code. But you might get other answers, and of course the answers might not agree. So it's basically a race. DDS allows that for basically implementing fault-tolerant systems, that you have multiple services providing the same service, and you can just fire a request, and as long as one of them gives you the right action, then that's cool, right? If one of them dies, you don't care. The other one will just seamlessly take over. That's the idea behind DDS. But in ROS, it's just basically from an application point of view, if you design the system like that, you're probably going to run into problems, because you never know if you send a request, you got to respond. If everybody in the system still agrees, you might at that point have completely non-consensus across the service.
I mean, my idea to make that work might be we include the node identification information in the service request, and then you send out the service request, all the things, receive it, they check, is this me? If not, ignore it. And then the one where it says, yes, it is me, they send the response, and then everyone ends up being happy in the end. But I don't know if that's just kind of a dirty way of doing it.
I'd be a little concerned about
Since you
doing
already say the word, I would say that's dirty, because at that point you are embedding in the user data in the payload something to identify what to do and not to do. For example, the client never knows if the server is going to respond, or maybe you agree on the protocol on the content level that the server will always respond, but will send you in the response the flag, I'm not in charge. I don't know, whatever, right? So I think that's I wouldn't do that, because you might have like so many requests pending which will never get a response. At that point, if you want that separation, I think the right way is to embed it into the topic name and make sure you know which one you talk to.
Yeah.
Okay. My question would be, how would a tool that wants to sort of pull all these different remote processes, how's it going to get those topic strings? Is there a way
you can query for all the advertised topics on the system via discovery. So you can, especially if you're in Python, it's a lot easier. You can just dynamically list the topics and then subscribe to them at runtime.
Okay. So you could do like all topics ending in this.
Yeah, well, you kind of just do get all topics and then you filter their names.
And usually you know the service name you're looking for, and you can just look for this service name in any namespace and just like create clients for each of them. You can do that, certainly.
Exactly. Okay. You also get information about their type, so you could, if you wanted to not depend on name, which I think depending on name is fine, but if you wanted to not depend on name, you could also look for the specific message type on the topic and then just subscribe to all of those. Or
probably check all of them. Yeah. Name and type, just in case, because who knows what people are going to call their topic someday.
Yeah. So those are the things you could do for instrumentation like that, if you want to inspect the running remote distributed system.
And basically the same kind of difficulty we have for parameters, right? If a node changes a parameter, he can either advertise it on a global topic, then everybody can subscribe to the global topic. That means everybody gets everything, right? Or you say the node publishes its events on a topic which is specific to the node. That means you can subscribe exactly to updates from one node, but of course it makes the other case that you're actually interested in all of them more complicated, because you have to continuously look for new topics or new nodes to come up to also make sure to subscribe to their parameter events, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think this is just a complexity. At that point, you have to decide which one of the two you want to be willing to take the cons from.
Mm-hmm.
Until we offer content filtering, but that's different topic.
Yeah. So I mean the messages that you send could be on a common topic as long as you put the machine ID in there so you can differentiate them. But the services will need to be uniquely namespaced.
Okay. Yeah.
So it could sort of be, because the messages are more of a broadcast thing. It's sort of like /diagnostics or /statistics.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you can certainly sketch use cases where that's going to be a problem too if you share the topic, because you can have the case you have a setup where you have two machines operating robot, right? And one produces a lot of events, and the other one is like pretty low, and you want to just look at what's happening on the low side computer. And you still have to subscribe to all the data from the other one, which might be over a Wi-Fi connection, not what you want, right? I mean, there's for every scenario we probably build, there's probably a counter scenario where that might be an issue.
Right. So I'm not even sure if in the end we'll need any of the topics, because I don't think we'll need a heartbeat really. Like I don't know.
Heartbeat, well, if we make it a unique topic, you could use the liveliness QoS to understand the heartbeat of the topic rather than building it in. And I would recommend that we do that. You could have there's a few ways that you could use QoS to accomplish things like understanding that it's alive without having to build any functionality yourself.
Yeah, so I don't know if there will actually end up being any topics on this node, because pretty much everything you want to do with it is an
Process status is interesting, theoretically,
Well,
especially if you latch it so that you can check the last node status.
yeah. Well, that was defined as a message because I envision it being a component of a service, like like a
Oh,
type.
it's just part of the return type. It's not actually published.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. That's.
But it could be. I mean, I wasn't sure if
Makes
we
sense.
wanted that sort of status broadcast out, or if we just said, just ask me if you want this.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I didn't internalize that.
Well, it could be like I'm not sure if we want. I mean, if you do you think there would be a case where we might want to have a topic continuously broadcasting that status?
I guess we don't currently for nodes, and it feels like it might be over featuring this design to introduce that.
Yeah.
So like having the service on the context to ask for the current statuses makes perfect sense. But yeah, I don't think it's worth introducing the continuous broadcast of status right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because it only really means anything to tools that don't exist yet.
Exactly.
We'd be making to take advantage of this, but
yeah, like there's nothing stopping us from adding that feature in later if we wanted it. So it's probably keep the design focused.
Yeah, my idea was sort of like eventually you could envision making like a load balancing node that would automatically keep track of usages of individual processes and be smart enough to move them around to machines that aren't as loaded. Sort of one of the long-term ideas I had in mind for that to be used for.
Is it common to have a timestamp on a service response?
I don't know. I just sort of assumed all messages usually had one.
Yeah, I was wondering actually if a full-on header would make sense here. I don't know if maybe there's some value to having the base TF frame of the robot. I don't know.
But yeah, like the standard header has a bunch of information that we wouldn't really care about, I don't think.
I mean, maybe in a multi-machine system you do have a TF tree with various base nodes, but then you probably are just you're not doing that in your understanding of process liveliness. You're going to handle your TF infrastructure somewhere else. So yeah, maybe a full-on header is not important here. Just a thought.
And it would be the other nodes that are being managed by this that.
Yeah, that would have their headers and would have
their TFs.
Yeah, because that's the only other information in the header, right? Like we don't have sequence anymore because that's part of the underlying ARMW, and so it's just timestamp and frame, right?
Yeah, as far as I am aware. But I don't even know if it's needed in a service call because I don't know. Maybe it'd be useful for measuring how long it takes to get a response someday, but I don't know.
Well, because the timestamp you're getting, I guess there's an implicit assumption that you have some sort of time sync mechanism across the machines, because if the remote machine timestamps its response, you don't for sure know what that means unless you're using same time.
Is there not a DDS sort of common time that's managed by
maybe well, I mean, it's not, we're not using it by default right now. ROS time by default when you use the clock is using the I think it's the monotonic wall clock on the system. It might not even be monotonic by default. It might just be the system clock. I can't remember. Maybe Dirk knows.
Yeah, I mean, maybe since we're getting into multi-machine stuff with this, it might be worth considering a way to use like an underlying DDS time so that you can measure time in a way that's synced across all your machines.
Yeah, I'm just gonna call it out. I don't have an answer, but it's like
yeah, that seems like a bigger change. It's sort of beyond the scope of this, but it might be something to keep in mind when as multi-machine stuff becomes more well supported.
Yeah, it might be something that just like maybe there's a call out in the document that like it's out of scope for this design to talk about synchronization of time. I think that an out of scope section.
Yeah, like a call out so it stays on our radar somewhat.
like we thought about this, it's going to come into play at some point, but we're not designing it here for this reason.
Yeah.
That
sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. So something else I was wondering about is how well is this going to play with all of the ROS2 Tier 1 platforms? Like, have we thought about Mac and Windows? Maybe SSH just handles them okay, but...
Yeah, the only thought we put into it was sort of wrapped up in Rogers refactor, where like basically we have like a base class for just a remote machine class, and then at least for this refactor we'll be providing an SSH one.
Okay, so as long as the remote machine has SSH and has a and it doesn't necessarily have to have a launch service node remotely. It just, because if we're going to do the sort of, what is it, only exists during the SSH session functionality as a, you can build that in one go and then improve on it with the launch service node.
It would be built with the abstract base classes as much as possible so that people could supply other implementations.
So
they really needed something other than SSH.
Yeah, so with the SSH, I guess the question is, would that SSH remote execute action, whatever, like it's going to be like a launch ROS.action or something like that, or a launch.action, would that, how would that handle Mac and Windows? Does it have to explicitly know that the remote machine has that operating system in order to successfully launch nodes?
I actually don't know, because I've not really crossed over to Windows trying to do.
It's definitely not the majority use case out there, but there are Mac and Windows users, and as Tier 1 support, we want to make sure, especially for core features like this, to think about how we're going to support them.
Yeah, I think Windows is getting better at sort of, using SSH and supporting it and behaving in a way more akin to what like Unix-based systems would be expected to behave. So I don't know if that means we can just ignore it, but
well, cause maybe the launch syntax is slightly different for a Windows SSH, or maybe you can SSH into Windows with Bash using their Linux subsystem, and or whatever it is. Like I'm definitely not a Windows expert. I just want to make sure we got it.
Yeah, basically the only thought we put in is, okay, we give you a base class so you can make your own.
So if we need to,
works on Windows.
Windows SSH or a Windows session manager or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Somebody who has more domain experience, they want to step in and help us out to make an SSH one that does work across all of them. That'd be.
Yeah, I think that as long as we say in the design that that it should work out of the box for those platforms, I think the implementation details can be handled, and you can partially get partway there on implementing a design, right? And then say this design's not fully complete because this part of the implementation is missing. So for example, with the cross-compile design doc, we put it in design doc and we implemented part of it, and they're still not all the way there to what the design doc called out, but it does some of the stuff. So I think it's useful in the design to at least call out your requirements, and even if you don't make it all the way there in the first pass, you have set it out design.
Right. Yeah. It's important to call those out too, because one issue that I've run into and other people I've worked with when getting a ROS2 is some frustration some of my coworkers have had with trying to find out what actually is supported right now. Like they read a design document or they go to what they think is the documentation, and it says it does all these things, but really it doesn't. It's more of a declaration of intent than a documentation of how it currently works. It's not always what you're reading.
There are a few functionality sets that are best described in the design, and the design is not 100% in line with the implementation, and they're not well documented elsewhere right now. I think that's one of our, from my perspective, one of the major things we want to address in ROS2 coming up to the next LTS is the documentation infrastructure. At least that's one of the things I'm thinking pretty hard about right now.
Yeah, because most of it, or good part of it, only exists really in the design document. There's not really okay, now that we've built it, let's document how it works. That doesn't really exist for many things, but maybe it's helpful.
Yeah, I mean there are the although I'm never sure where to find them. It's like docs.ros2.org. No, maybe. Oh yeah, it is. Like there is sort of the overview of the base, like the build system and the client libraries, and then it just doesn't extend beyond to other parts of the ecosystem, like launch and stuff. So like we've got, there's a good core start here. Although I am never 100% sure whether I'm going to find this correctly. So that's one of those things that maybe it's just discoverability. Well, somehow we ran all the way to 10 o'clock. That went quick, actually.
Yeah, that was helpful. A lot of good points.
It's an exciting feature set. I am looking forward to us moving forward with this, and I feel like that was a useful discussion.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely have a lot of things in mind now to work in the document in the next revision. Probably break it out into two. So maybe this current design document I'll just sort of repurpose to just be the SSH launch specific thing, because that's sort of the baseline functionality we want, minimal.
Yep, makes sense.
And then add another design document for the node additions with the rest of it as a separate pull request. And
cool. Okay, well, thanks for sharing this with us and bringing it up as a breakout meeting. I enjoyed this as a topic for a breakout meeting, so I think we could definitely do like design reviews in the future. This feels like it fits, under the general umbrella we want to cover as part of this group. Even though we're not implementing functionality in launch, it feels like it fits in the topics we want to think about and talk about.
Cool.
So.
Yeah, so thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for all the work.
Yeah, and we'll be having, I think we're still planning to have the regular meeting next week, but me and Karsten are both going to be out on vacation, so I'm not sure yet who's going to run it. I think we'll find someone from my team at Amazon. Maybe it'll be Devin, I don't know.
It'll still be the same Chime link?
Yeah, it'll still be the same Chime link. Okay. Yeah. But we'll keep you up to date on the discourse thread on that. There's an off chance we'll just cancel it if we can't find someone to run it. But we'll, as of today, plan on it happening.
All right. Sounds good.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you again next time.